The air in Blackwood Precinct smelled perpetually of stale coffee and desperation. Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose face had been weathered into a permanent expression of skepticism, stared out the rain-streaked window. It was 3:17 a.m. The kind of time nothing good ever happened, just the hours reserved for regret and the truly unnatural. Miles had been a cop for 16 years. He'd seen the worst the human mind could concoct. The brutality, the malice, the sheer, senseless waste. But the file currently weighing down his desk, the missing persons, Elias Vance case, felt different. It was a clean slate of bizarre. Elias Vance, a respected university professor of philosophy, vanished 3 days ago. No forced entry, no struggle, just an untouched breakfast table and a cell phone resting silently on the counter. The only unusual detail was the note pinned to the corkboard above his desk. It wasn't a ransom demand or a goodbye. It was a single cryptic sentence written in immaculate cursive. The only sound left is the one you refuse to hear. Miles rubbed the bridge of his nose, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. His partner, Detective Sarah Jenkins, a sharp, pragmatic woman who was usually the voice of reason, was leaning against the doorway, nursing a lukewarm cup. "Find anything in the forensics report, Miles?" she asked, her voice low. "Nothing. Absolutely sterile," he sighed, pushing the file away. "No fibers, no prints we don't already have, no trace of Elias leaving the house. It's like he evaporated." Jenkins pushed off the frame and walked closer. "Except for that weird sound anomaly the tech team flagged. Did you look at that?" Miles pulled up the digital file again. During the initial sweep of Vance's quiet, isolated home, a routine audio recording had captured a brief, barely perceptible sequence. The techs had isolated it, a high-frequency burst lasting exactly 1.7 seconds. It wasn't a siren, a dog, or a car. It was classified as inconclusive, possibly acoustic feedback. "They dismissed it as interference," Miles said, his eyes scanning the waveform. "Yeah, well, I don't buy it," Jenkins countered, tapping the screen. "Listen to the raw feed, Miles. Right after that burst, the ambient noise floor in the recording drops to nearly zero. It's not just quiet, it's dead quiet. Too quiet for a suburban neighborhood at 11 p.m. Miles leaned in and put on his headphones, playing the clip. Static, the faint hum of an HVAC unit, a refrigerator click. Then the sharp, almost painful zzzzzzzzz sound, and then nothing, a profound, absolute vacuum of sound. The refrigerator hum was gone. The HVAC unit was gone. Even the hiss of the microphone seemed to disappear. Miles felt a chill crawl up his neck. It was more than silence, it felt like an erasure. "It's a glitch," he murmured, trying to rationalize. "Or it's the only real clue," Jenkins insisted. "The only sound left is the one you refuse to hear." Vance wrote that, Miles. Maybe he heard something or didn't hear something just before he vanished. A sudden ring cut through the stillness of the precinct. Miles grabbed the phone. "Corbin." The dispatcher's voice was tight, strained. "Detective, we have a code for." A 911 call came in from the Vance residence just 5 minutes ago. The caller hung up immediately, but the address trace confirmed it. "Someone is in that house." Miles exchanged a look with Jenkins. "We're on our way. Do not send patrol. We handle this." 10 minutes later, their unmarked sedan screeched to a halt in front of the Vance home. The house was dark, shrouded by ancient oak trees, the rain turning the shadows into menacing, fluid shapes. They drew their weapons and approached the front door cautiously. The silence here was oppressive, thick. As Miles reached for the handle, Jenkins hissed, pointing at the window that a single light was on now in Professor Vance's study. And moving across the glass, slow and deliberate, was a shadow. Not a human shadow. It was tall, impossibly elongated, with a subtle, jerky motion that suggested something. Struggling to navigate on two limbs that weren't quite right, Miles kicked the door open. "Police, hands where I can see them." The study was empty. The light was on, the air conditioning was running again, humming loudly. The source of the shadow was nowhere to be found. But the corkboard had a new addition. Pinned directly below Vance's original note was a crudely drawn stick figure. Its eyes were two empty circles, and its hands were raised in a silent, pleading gesture. and beneath the drawing, someone had written a single horrifying word, not in cursive like Vance's, but in thick, unsteady block letters as if written by a shaking hand. Listen. Miles's flashlight beam swept across the desk, revealing one final detail. A small, high-quality audio recorder, not belonging to Vance, sitting on the blotter. It was recording. Jenkins, her breath catching, reached for her radio. "I don't like this, Miles. This isn't just a missing person anymore." Miles stared at the recorder, his blood freezing. He could hear the low, static-laced hiss of the room being recorded on the small device. He knew he had to listen to whatever was on it, but as he reached out, he noticed a sliver of paper tucked under the recorder. He pulled it free. It was a transcript, typed neatly, detailing the last 3 minutes of Professor Vance's life, minutes that hadn't yet been played. The transcript ended with this final, chilling line: frowny face, 2 minutes and 59 seconds, Vance, whispering, panicked, "It's not a sound, it's the opposite. It's the moment before the universe collapses back into absolute." Miles's hand trembled as he looked up, the oppressive silence of the house suddenly roaring in his ears. The audio recorder continued to record the present moment, waiting. He slowly lifted his own gun, pointing it at the darkness of the hallway. The hunt was on, and Miles knew deep in his gut that the thing they were hunting wasn't looking for sound. It was looking for silence. Miles's flashlight beam was a nervous, searching spotlight in the dark hall. The transcript he held was proof of a terror far beyond a simple abduction. He looked at Jenkins, her face pale in the faint glow of her own tactical light. "It's a countdown, Sarah. And whatever absolute silence is, Vance found it," Miles muttered, holstering his weapon just enough to free his hands. He picked up the foreign audio recorder, its red LED a malevolent little eye. "This is a crime scene," Jenkins said, her voice tight. "We need to bag and tag this. Don't touch anything else, Miles." "Forget the protocol for a second," Miles snapped, overriding her. "Whoever left this here wants us to listen. They're playing a game, and the faster we understand the rules, the better chance we have of finding Vance, or figuring out what happened to him." He found the play button and pressed it. The initial seconds were just the dull, familiar sounds of the house he and Jenkins had already heard in the police recording. The refrigerator's soft whir, the distant drone of traffic, the low, steady sound of Professor Vance breathing. 15 seconds, Vance, muttering to himself, still nothing. The resonant frequency, it should be apparent. 30 seconds, Vance clears throat. "I swear the house is quieter tonight." Almost deafeningly so. The tape continued, a slow, agonizing crawl through the mundane. Miles felt his impatience rising, but he kept listening, fixated on the transcript in his hand, which now matched the audio. 1 minute and 45 seconds, Vance. A sharp intake of breath. Oh my God, the professor's breathing hitched, suddenly shallow and rapid. The ambient sounds on the tape began to subtly warp. The refrigerator's hum, instead of being a steady 60 Hz tone, started to wobble, its pitch oscillating unnervingly. 2 minutes and 5 seconds, Vance, it's here. I hear it, but, no, I feel it. It's a pressure. It's like the air itself is trying to push sound out of existence. Miles glanced around the study. The humming air conditioner suddenly seemed loud, almost aggressive. Jenkins gripped her gun tighter, scanning the perimeter. 2 minutes and 20 seconds. The high-frequency ZZZZT sound recorded by the police team occurs here on the tape, sharp and piercing. The sound blast was brief, painful even through the headphones. And then, the sudden, terrifying drop. The tape went dead. Not static, not muffled, but cleanly silent. Every background noise, every subtle indication of a living environment, was gone. If Miles hadn't been wearing headphones, he would have assumed the recorder had failed. 2 minutes and 35 seconds, Vance. His voice is barely a whisper, ragged with fear. It works. It actually works. But it's not passive. It's hungry. It's draining the acoustic energy. No, the vibration of everything. Miles could hear only the professor's ragged breathing, a sound of pure terror isolated against a void. The voice was impossibly clear, like it was speaking directly into Miles's mind. 2 minutes and 50 seconds, Vance. I see the shadow. It follows the void, it is the void. 2 minutes and 59 seconds, Vance. Whispering, panicked, it's not a sound, it's the opposite. It's the moment before the universe collapses back into absolute. Then, abruptly, the recording ended. The void of silence stopped, and the sounds of the current moment, the A.C. Jenkins's low breath, Miles's own heartbeat, slammed back into his ears with overwhelming force. Miles ripped the headphones off. His ears were ringing, not from volume, but from the sudden transition from absolute acoustic vacuum back to normal reality. What the hell was that? Jenkins demanded, her eyes wide. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath for a second. That, Miles breathed, his hand shaking as he put the recorder down, was the sound of Elias Vance disappearing. That ZZZZZKKTT wasn't interference. It was a catalyst. It's an acoustic weapon, a frequency designed to achieve total silence. He looked at the stick figure with the empty eyes and the plea to listen. The professor was researching something, Sarah. A frequency that cancels out sound, a reverse resonance. But whatever he found, it wasn't just physical, it was biological. Miles turned to the bookshelf. The only book out of place was a heavy leather-bound volume titled, A Study of Pre-Socratic Acoustic Philosophy. He pulled it out. Tucked inside was a single laminated card that it wasn't a library card or a bookmark. It was a badge, an old, almost military-looking ID card. The photo was Elias Vance, looking much younger, wearing the uniform of a research specialist for a shadowy, defunct government agency known only by the cryptic initials PSI. He wasn't just a philosophy professor, Miles whispered. He was working for some deep cover outfit. And that note on the wall wasn't a clue. It was a warning. Suddenly, the lights in the study flickered violently and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Simultaneously, a deep, grinding metallic sound, too heavy to be a refrigerator, echoed from the basement below their feet. Miles? Jenkins yelled, spinning around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. Basement. Miles yelled back, adrenaline surging. He knew the creature, or whoever was playing this deadly game, was still in the house. As they reached the basement door, a new sound began, a low mechanical hissing that sounded exactly like the air escaping a massive airtight chamber. Then the grinding stopped, replaced by a wet, dragging sound, like heavy cloth being pulled across a concrete floor, moving slowly up the stairs toward them. Miles and Jenkins stood shoulder to shoulder, guns leveled at the dark door. The sound of the dragging stopped just inches from the wood. The silence returned, but this time it was worse. It was expectant. Then from the other side of the door, a low, guttural voice, not Vance's and not entirely human, whispered a single chilling phrase right against the wood. You're making too much noise, detective. Miles knew they had just been trapped. The voice from behind the basement door was thick, wet, and utterly devoid of human warmth. It was a synthesized whisper that settled like ice in Miles's chest. You heard that, right? Jenkins hissed, her aim unwavering, her knuckles white against the grip of her Uzi. I heard it. And whatever it is, it knows who we are. Miles confirmed, his voice low and steady despite the tremor running through his hands. He took a calculated step back from the door, careful not to break the silence they desperately needed to maintain. It said we're making too much noise, Jenkins reminded him. That's what Vance was researching. It wants silence. Then we give it quiet, Miles decided. But we're not running. We came for a 911 call and we're leaving with the source of it. He nodded toward the door handle. On 3. I kick, you light up the space. Jenkins braced herself, her breath held tight. 1, 2, 3. Miles slammed his boot into the door just above the lock. The old wood splintered with a deafening crack. He burst through the opening, Jenkins's powerful flashlight cutting a beam into the stairwell. The basement was a concrete coffin, its air thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. The staircase descended into a single massive room. But the creature, the shadow Vance had spoken of, was gone. They swept their lights around. The dragging noise was explained. A large, canvas-wrapped bundle, stained dark, lay in the center of the floor. But what drew their attention was the far wall that wasn't a typical basement wall. It was a monolithic steel slab, riveted and sealed, clearly designed to withstand extreme pressure. A single heavy circular vault door, like something off an old U-boat, was set into the steel. "This isn't a basement," Jenkins murmured, lowering her weapon slightly. "It's a bunker. And the lock, it's electronic." Near the vault door there was a small desk setup, clearly Professor Vance's current workspace. On the desk, nestled beside complex wiring schematics and soundproofing foam, was a thick, confidential file folder labeled PSI Project Chrysalis Acoustic Suppression. Miles grabbed the file. The first page was a heavily redacted executive summary. Project Chrysalis. Goal: to create a localized, self-sustaining zone of absolute acoustic nullification, AAN. This AAN zone, once triggered by the designated echo frequency, EF, would not merely cancel sound waves, but actively convert sonic energy into a controllable, non-detectable field. Redacted section. The long-term objective is the creation of a mobile, undetectable enforcement mechanism capable of neutralizing targets without leaving physical evidence. End of summary. A zone of absolute silence, Jenkins summarized, her face pale. Vance wasn't just studying it, he was building a weapon. "And whatever we heard on that tape, it was the echo frequency," Miles said, flipping through the schematics. He triggered it and it locked him into the AN zone. He found a section in the file titled, Biological/Psychological Side Effects. The handwriting was Professor Vance's, rushed and frantic, scribbled in the margins. "The AN field doesn't just silence the external world, it silences the internal world. The auditory cortex, lacking input, begins to manufacture sound, or the lack of it. It creates the echo shadow, a perceived entity composed entirely of the user's deepest, most primal fear of the void." Miles slammed the file shut, a cold realization dawning. "The shadow we saw, the voice, that was the echo shadow. It's a localized, psychological terror projected onto the victim by the silence itself." "Wait," Jenkins said, pointing her flashlight at the vault door's keypad. "Look." A series of 10 digits had been punched in, and the last one was still glowing green, indicating a freshly completed sequence. The vault was unlocked. He was trying to get in when he recorded that tape, Miles realized. He created the monster and then ran back to the one place he thought could contain it. Before they could move, the heavy metallic hissing sound started again, this time right behind them, cutting them off from the staircase. They spun around. Standing at the base of the stairs, blocking their only exit, was a figure that it was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, wearing a form-fitting suit that absorbed the light. Its movements were fluid and disturbing, like joints bending in the wrong direction. Its head was tilted, and where a face should have been, there was only the smooth, featureless material of a sealed black helmet. But what truly froze Miles's blood was the large, high-tech shoulder-mounted device it carried. It hummed with a low, barely perceptible frequency, and the air around it shimmered. "The enforcement mechanism," Miles choked out, lifting his gun. The figure didn't move. It simply raised one hand, pointed a gloved finger at the canvas-wrapped bundle on the floor, and then pointed at the open vault. Then the whisper returned, sounding directly in their ears, overriding the distance and the air. "The professor made his choice. Now, Detective Corbin, you make yours." The canvas bundle on the floor began to emit a low, wet sound, like something struggling to break free. The figure in the sealed black suit, the physical manifestation of the echo shadow, stood silent, demanding a decision. Miles felt the cold weight of the entity's presence. It wasn't just a vision born of silence, it was a predator, and it was forcing them into a corner. The canvas bundle on the floor began to convulse more violently, emitting a sickening, muffled sound. It was clearly where the initial, dragging noise had originated, and whatever was inside was alive and terrified. "Sarah," Miles whispered, his eyes locked on the figure. "Go for the vault. Get inside and try to seal us in. This thing is stalling us." "And leave you here with that thing?" Jenkins challenged, her voice tight. "It's not after me yet, it's making me choose," Miles countered, his mind racing through the PSI file's notes. "Vance designed the echo shadow. There has to be a kill switch, a failsafe, or a flaw." He slowly shifted his focus from the shadow to the canvas bundle, knowing the creature expected him to fear the unknown. "The vault is protection, Miles. The bundle is a trap." Maybe, Miles said, taking a calculated step towards the bundle. But if this thing is feeding off silence, what happens if we give it what it doesn't expect? He took one more decisive step, his heavy boots crunching on something small and brittle on the concrete floor, a shard of glass. He kicked the brittle item toward the shadow. The figure didn't react to the sound. Miles confirmed his suspicion. The echo shadow, or at least the suit, was operating within its own localized zone of acoustic suppression, making it nearly impervious to external sounds. Miles reached the bundle. It was tied with industrial plastic straps. He plunged his knife into the thick canvas, ripping it open. Inside, wrapped tightly and duct-taped, was not a monster but a person. A young lab assistant Miles recognized from the university staff photos, now bruised and gagged, her eyes wide with overwhelming panic. She was struggling not against the ropes but against the gag, which looked custom-made, a thick, sound-dampening muzzle. Miles sliced the heavy duct tape away from her mouth. As soon as the muzzle was off, the assistant gasped, a raw, uncontrolled scream tearing from her throat. "He's gone." He went into the void. The scream was immediate, loud and real. The echo shadow, which had been standing rigid and still by the stairs, suddenly recoiled. Its posture shifted, not from physical pain but from confusion or sensory overload. The humming device on its shoulder stuttered, emitting a brief, high-pitched whine. "It hates the uncontrolled noise." Miles yelled to Jenkins, seizing the moment. "It's not truly silent, it's just designed to block sounds below a certain threshold." Miles grabbed the assistant and pulled her toward the open vault. Jenkins, seeing the entity momentarily stunned, poured fire at the shadow's center mass. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the dense, ceramic-like armor of the suit, but the impact and the sound of the gunfire were enough to make the creature stagger. "Inside. Now." Miles shoved the hysterical assistant through the vault door. Just as Miles was about to follow, the shadow regained its focus. It lifted its arm, and the shoulder device rotated slightly, aiming directly at the vault's entrance. The air around the device shimmered, and a visible wave of pressure shot out, silent and devastating. Miles felt the impact like a physical blow, a pressure that instantly forced the air from his lungs. His ears popped agonizingly and the world went dull. The echo frequency. The entity was actively creating a highly concentrated AN zone right at the entrance. Jenkins, already halfway into the vault, turned back, screaming Miles's name, but the sound was muffled, distant. Miles tried to move, but the pressure was overwhelming, pinning him to the metal frame of the vault. He felt the terrifying internal acoustic drain Vance had described, the prelude to panic, the beginning of the echo shadow taking root in his mind. Miles's vision blurred. Through the haze, he saw Jenkins struggle, then slam the heavy, steel vault door shut, the massive locking mechanism engaging with a violent, final clang. He was outside. He was alone. The immediate pressure of the end zone dissipated slightly as the door sealed, but the shadow was now advancing on him, its movements smoother, more confident. The creature stopped just 2 feet away, its sealed helmet gazing down. Miles, gasping for air, looked up at his reflection in the smooth, black surface of the helmet. The thing was silent, but its message was clear. A whisper, this time, purely synthetic and electronic, buzzed directly inside his skull, bypassing his eardrums entirely. "The silence is permanent, Detective. The project is complete. Welcome to the null zone." The shadow raised a long black-gloved hand and reached toward Miles's face. Miles saw his life flash before his eyes, not with memories, but with a terrifying absolute visual of nothingness. Miles knew he had only one chance, the PSI file. It was still clutched in his hand. He fumbled open to the last page, the section on contingency protocol. The words were an explanation of the echo frequency's power source, a high-yield, unstable resonant crystal. Miles didn't have a weapon that could penetrate the suit, but he had something else. An ear-splitting, universally loud, uncontrolled noise source. With his last surge of strength, Miles reached up, grabbed the heavy, humming shoulder device on the Shadow's armor, and slammed his guns but repeatedly into the main chassis. The Shadow reacted with speed and violence, trying to bat him away. But Miles held on, smashing the butt of the gun into the chassis one last time. The device shattered. Instead of a catastrophic explosion, there was a sound, a sound so piercing, so high-pitched and uncontrolled, that it was physical agony. It was the sound of the resonant crystal being exposed and wildly destabilizing. The echo shadow roared, a screech that wasn't sound but the immediate deafening noise of its own internal acoustic dampening failing violently. The creature's suit began to emit smoke. The shadow staggered back, clutching its head, its movements reduced to jerky, spasming convulsions. The internal acoustic vacuum had been breached by the most violent noise imaginable. Miles scrambled back toward the now sealed vault door, deafened, disoriented, and tasting blood. He knew the screech wouldn't last. The shadow was wounded but not defeated. Miles hammered frantically on the steel door. "Sarah. Open up. Open up." The heavy steel remained cold, silent, and sealed. The basement was a symphony of chaos. The uncontrolled, piercing screech of the shattered resonant crystal was slowly fading, leaving behind a ringing, agonizing silence in Miles's ears. He was temporarily deafened, a victim of his own desperate tactic. The echo shadow was on the ground, twitching, smoke curling from the shoulder where Miles had smashed the PSI device. The silence had been shattered, but the monster was still alive, and Miles was trapped between the wounded entity and the unyielding steel of the vault door. Miles hammered his fist against the vault, trying to yell, but he couldn't even hear the sound of his own impact. He felt the vibration, a dull thud against the steel. "Sarah. Open up," he thought, panicking. Jenkins and the lab assistant were safe inside, but they couldn't know the shadow wasn't defeated, only crippled. And the shadow was starting to stir as he backed away from the door, his eyes darting between the reviving entity and the locked vault. He still had the PSI file. He needed to find a way to communicate, a way to tell Jenkins he was alive and that the shadow was still a threat. Miles dropped to his knees, flipping through the file schematics. If Vance had designed this vault, there had to be an internal communication system, a way for researchers to interface with the experiments inside. That he found it on a heavily annotated diagram of the vault's locking system. Contingency interface Vance protocol, vibration-activated narrowband communication echo. Miles scanned the diagram. Vance, the acoustic philosopher, had anticipated the need for communication even in a state of absolute silence. The system used the density of the vault steel to transmit specific rhythmic vibrations across the subharmonic frequency, vibrations that a tuned receiver could interpret as sound. The input port for the VNC protocol was a small, sealed panel near the locking mechanism. Miles scrambled over to the panel. It was secured by 4 hex head screws. He pulled the PSI badge out of his pocket, the one with Vance's photo, and used the rigid edge of the laminated plastic to pry off the screw covers that he needed a tool. His gun was useless for turning hex screws. Miles glanced at the shadow. It was slowly beginning to rise, its movements jerky but purposeful. The smoke had stopped, but the helmet remained tilted, as if listening intently to the ringing silence in its own internal auditory cortex. It knew Miles was near. Miles spotted a piece of debris on the floor near the shadow's initial position, a short, snapped piece of metal rebar from the splintered door frame. It was a terrifying risk, but his only option. Miles sprinted low, keeping the damaged, sparking shoulder of the shadow's suit between himself and the rest of the creature. He snatched the rebar, the shadow reacting instantly, a black-gloved hand lashing out and grazing Miles's jacket. That he scrambled back to the vault panel, jamming the rebar into the hex screw head. He twisted with brutal force, the raw steel grating against itself. The screws began to turn, one by one. He removed the panel cover. Inside was a small circuit board and a simple copper plate connected to the vault structure. There was no keyboard, no microphone. The protocol was truly just about vibration. Miles looked back at the shadow. It was fully upright now and it was moving. Not running, but gliding, its silent advance punctuated only by the occasional scraping of its heavy boots on the concrete. Miles grabbed the broken end of the rebar and began to tap a rhythm on the copper plate, counting the thuds against the internal ringing in his ears. He had to be quick and precise. He tapped out a simple, prearranged cop code that he and Jenkins had used for emergency situations. 3 rapid taps, a pause, 2 rapid taps, a pause, 3 rapid taps, 323. Officer in immediate danger, require assistance. Miles tapped it once. Nothing. He tapped it again, harder, focusing the shockwave through the copper plate and into the vast steel door. Inside the vault, Jenkins, still reeling reeling from the force of the end zone and the shock of sealing Miles outside, heard a strange, deep chim rumble. Not a sound, but a rhythmic feeling through the floor of the vault. She recognized the cadence immediately. Miles is alive. He's telling me to act. Jenkins, despite the protests of the lab assistant, scrambled to the internal locking mechanism. Outside, the shadow was only 10 feet away. Its helmet suddenly snapped up as if it too had detected the unusual subharmonic vibration. The creature paused, its dark head tilting, trying to process the sound it was designed to eliminate. Miles had one last, crucial message to send. He needed to tell her about the contingency protocol and the echo frequency's weakness. Uncontrolled, loud noise that he tapped the copper plate a third time, but the shadow was closing in, its large black hand reaching out. Miles barely had time to tap a final, desperate pattern. 4 rapid taps, a pause, 1 tap, a pause, 6 taps, 416. Use explosive force/acoustic failsafe, a code only they knew. The shadow was on him. Miles threw the rebar at the entity's chest as a distraction, but the creature ignored it, its hand closing around Miles's throat. Miles saw the void in the creature's helmet, a profound, depthless black that was the physical representation of the silence Vance had described. The creature was squeezing, its strength impossible, cutting off Miles's air. And then the vault door's locking mechanism began to work. Jenkins had received the message. She wasn't just opening the door. She was throwing the internal mechanism into a frantic, violent release cycle. The heavy steel door shook and began to grind open with a horrifying metal-on-metal scream, the loudest, most uncontrolled noise the basement had heard yet. The massive metal shriek was focused directly at the echo shadow, and it was too much. The creature released Miles instantly, howling a silent, terrifying shriek as it clutched its head. The vibrations and the raw sound of grinding metal overwhelmed its internal acoustic dampening system. Miles fell to the ground, gasping for air, rolling out of the way just as the vault door swung open. Jenkins was there, her eyes fierce, her weapon aimed. "Miles, are you okay?" The shoulder. The crystal. "It's the weak point," Miles managed, crawling past the threshold and into the vault. "Don't stop the noise." The shadow was convulsing violently, its suit emitting jets of thick, oily black smoke. It had lost the fight for silence, and the noise was tearing it apart. Jenkins didn't hesitate. She looked at the internal control panel and slammed her hand onto the large, red, unprotected button marked Emergency Power Purge. The vault system roared into overdrive, pumping a final deafening blast of air and sound pressure into the basement. Miles sealed the door just as the basement plunged back into total, unholy silence. The fight was over, but the terror was just beginning. They were safe but trapped. The massive steel vault door sealed with a final hydraulic hiss, cutting off the last vestiges of the Echo Shadow's agonizing, soundless demise. The air inside the vault was sterile, cold, and quiet, a profound, non-threatening silence that felt like sanctuary after the acoustic violence of the basement. Miles slumped against the cold metal, pulling in deep, ragged breaths. He was bruised, half-deaf, and shaking. Jenkins rushed to him, checking his pulse and the red, bruised marks on his neck where the shadow had squeezed. "You're alive," she whispered, her own relief palpable. "That thing, did we get it?" "We crippled it. We overloaded its acoustic dampeners," Miles rasped, rubbing his throat. "But it was a contingency, Sarah. An experiment. It's not defeated until we destroy the source." The lab assistant, a young woman named Clara, was huddled in the corner, rocking and weeping silently. "Professor Vance, he told me it was a fail-safe," Clara whimpered, finally able to speak. "He said if the AN field became self-aware, we had to get to the vault. He called this place the Acoustic Sanctuary." Miles pushed himself up and surveyed their surroundings. The vault was not a storage unit, it was a self-contained, high-tech laboratory. The walls were lined with monitors, oscilloscopes, and sound-dampening acoustic foam. In the center of the room, under heavy glass, lay the central component of Project Chrysalis. A large, multifaceted crystal, the very one Miles had smashed a fragment of on the Shadow's suit. It pulsed with a faint, low-frequency blue light. The resonant crystal, Miles identified, pointing. "The heart of the AN zone. We need to disable that." Jenkins was looking at the main control console. "It's all proprietary tech. PSI branding everywhere. Look at this. She pointed to a series of chronological log entries flickering on a green monochrome screen. They detailed Vance's work, moving from theoretical success to catastrophic failure. Log entry 12/03 Vance. Theoretical success achieved. Stable AN field generation confirmed. Field actively absorbs sonic energy. Field integrity, nominal. Log entry December 5th. Vance. First biological test subject exposed to AN zone for 4 hours. Subject reports auditory hallucinations, deep paranoia, and the onset of the echo shadow. Subject's psychological profile shifted from mild-mannered to violent and territorial. Field integrity, contaminated. Log entry December 8th. Vance. The shadow has become self-sustaining. It doesn't dissipate when the AN zone is deactivated. It is a neurological feedback loop given physical form by the residual acoustic energy it absorbed. Containment breach imminent. Log entry December 9th. Vance. Last resort. I am initiating the ultimate experiment. To prevent the shadow from escaping and spreading, I must become the frequency. Miles stared at the final horrifying entry. He must become the frequency? He walked slowly toward the crystal in the center of the room. It was not resting on a pedestal. It was mounted into a custom life-sized containment chamber, and the chamber was currently occupied. Miles's breath hitched. Inside the crystal chamber, suspended in a thick, clear gel that was subtly vibrating, was Elias Vance. That he was alive, his eyes open, staring blankly ahead. He was naked and wired with dozens of microsensors, his body perfectly preserved, his skin translucent from the gel. Oh God, Miles. Jenkins covered her mouth, stepping back. Clara started sobbing uncontrollably. He didn't disappear, he sealed himself in. He said he was the only one who could handle the full silence. Miles looked from the preserved body to the final log entry. He didn't seal himself in for protection. He sealed himself in as the power source. Miles looked closer at Vance's face. There was a faint movement, a barely perceptible twitch of his lips. Vance was trying to communicate. Miles looked at the monitor next to the containment unit. A single, looping diagnostic reading was displayed. Subject A. Vance. Continuous low-frequency output. He turned himself into the central resonant crystal. Miles realized, horrified. He is the echo frequency. He's generating the pervasive, background silence that allows the shadow to exist. Miles carefully pressed his ear against the glass of the containment unit. He couldn't hear the gel or the humming, but deep inside his ringing ears, he heard something new, a faint, persistent whisper that felt like it was originating from his own spine. The whisper wasn't words, but a rapid, rhythmic sequence of tones, a code. Miles instinctively pulled out his notepad and pen, his hands flying across the paper as he translated the rhythm into musical notation, a language he understood from a childhood hobby. That he looked at the sheet. 5 distinct notes, repeated. Continuously, Jenkins looked over his shoulder. What is that? A message, Miles said, his eyes wide. He's been trying to talk to us the whole time. The whisper is the perpetual silence, the sound he refused to hear in the outside world, amplified inside the vault. Miles rushed back to the main console and found a schematic detailing the power relay. He looked at the final 5 tones he had transcribed. He's giving us the override code, Sarah. But not for the crystal. For the vault itself. Miles found the input sequence and began to punch in the tones on the console's numeric keypad, translating the frequency into the corresponding digits. As the final digit clicked, the vault's massive external lock began to grind, not to open, but to fail. A new warning flashed on the screen. Self-destruct sequence initiated. Core breach imminent. Miles stared at the screen, bewildered. The code wasn't the override. It was the self-destruct command. Suddenly Vance's lips twitched again. This time, a word was projected into Miles's mind, clear and agonizing. Noise? Miles looked at the crystal, then back at the console. He's not telling us to escape. He's telling us to destroy the source of his containment. The vault's internal temperature gauge began to spike, rising fast. They had seconds before the core overloaded and the blast wave of pure acoustic energy was released, destroying the house and everything within a 100-foot radius. "We have to stop the self-destruct," Jenkins yelled, grabbing the fire extinguisher. "No," Miles said, looking down at Vance's tormented, suspended body. "We have to finish what he started. He created the silence and now he wants the ultimate noise to end it all." The emergency lights inside the vault were flashing crimson, painting the sterile lab in a terrifying, pulsating glow. The console screamed its warning, "Core breach imminent 60 seconds." Miles knew the truth. Professor Vance hadn't given them an escape key, he'd given them a detonator. He was the perpetual whisper, and he wanted the nightmare to end with a bang, the ultimate acoustic overload. "The self-destruct is the solution, Sarah," Miles said, grabbing the fire extinguisher from Jenkins. "But the explosion has to be total. The shadow is still out there. If the blast doesn't reach it, the entity will reform." Miles rushed to the containment unit holding Vance. He noticed a small, external valve marked gel drain/vacuum seal. "The gel dampens the crystal's output," Miles explained, working the valve. "If we drain it, the crystal's power and Vance's resonant frequency will go critical faster and the resulting explosion will be pure acoustic devastation." "But draining the gel, that will kill him, Miles," Jenkins protested, looking at the suspended professor. "He's already gone, Sarah. He's a battery for a weapon that tried to kill us," Miles said, the grim resolve hardening his face. "He gave us the code. This is his final request." Miles flipped the valve. A low, glugging sound echoed in the vault as the clear gel began to drain out of the containment unit and into a floor conduit. Vance's eyes remained open, but his expression seemed to gain a strange, silent peace as his body was slowly exposed to the air. Core breach 40 seconds. Jenkins, watching the timer, knew she had to secure their escape route. The ceiling. The blueprints show a maintenance vent leading to the surface access panel. "Get Claire up there. I'll cover the vent when the blast hits," Miles ordered. He pointed the fire extinguisher at the massive central monitor bank. "This is the final piece. Fire extinguishers are pressurized tanks of chemical noise. They'll rupture when the acoustic pressure hits, amplifying the blast." Jenkins helped the hysterical Clara climb onto a bench and begin struggling with the heavy bolted maintenance panel high on the wall. Miles looked back at the containment unit. The gel was nearly gone. The central resonant crystal, now directly exposed, began to pulse a rapid, blinding white light. The entire vault began to vibrate violently, the low-frequency hum now a painful physical sensation. Core breach 20 seconds. Miles took the fire extinguisher and positioned it next to the console, taping its discharge handle down with thick industrial tape he found in the desk. He jammed the second extinguisher into the door's internal lock mechanism, hoping to ensure the seal would remain closed for the milliseconds needed to contain the pre-blast energy. That he glanced at Vance one last time. As the final drops of gel drained, Vance's lips moved again, and Miles heard a final internalized whisper, not panicked but instructional, "Open the lock, but keep the seal." Miles rushed to the inner locking mechanism of the heavy vault door. "He wants me to fail the seal but not the lock. If the seal is compromised, the explosive acoustic energy will shoot directly up the stairwell and into the house." Core breach 10 seconds. That he quickly punched a random sequence into the external key override, causing the electronic lock to sputter and retract, but the internal heavy pressure seal remained engaged by the jammed fire extinguisher. The door groaned slightly, becoming unstable, ready to violently spring open. "Sarah, we're out of time." Jenkins tore the maintenance panel open just as Clara scrambled through. "I'm securing the ladder. Get up here." Miles jumped onto the bench, his hands finding the edge of the crawl space. Core breach 05 seconds. That he pulled himself up just as the central crystal in the containment unit went from blinding white to absolute, terrifying black. Core breach 03 seconds. Miles looked down through the open vent. The fire extinguishers were taped down, the crystal was silent, and the exposed body of Professor Vance was rigid, his final sacrifice made. Core breach 01 second. And then the ultimate noise. It wasn't an explosion in the conventional sense, but a singular, overwhelming wave of acoustic energy. The air inside the vault ruptured. The sound was so profound that it wasn't heard, it was felt, a clean, physical blast that shredded the acoustic foam, disintegrated the control console, and blew the jammed steel door wide open, sending the heavy mechanism screaming up the stairwell. Miles, protected only by the ceiling above the vent, felt his eardrums rupture, followed by a thick wave of heat and debris. Upstairs, the echo shadow, recovering near the top of the stairwell, was instantly enveloped in the acoustic shockwave. The force of the sound, amplified by the fire extinguishers and channeled up the basement stairs, tore the creature's suit apart. The black, featureless helmet shattered, and the contained entity inside, the neurological feedback loop, was hit by an instantaneous crushing wave of total, uncontrolled acoustic force. The house shuddered violently, glass shattered for blocks, and then, mercifully, there was silence. A real, natural silence, broken only by the gentle sound of rain and the ringing in Miles's ears. Miles, dizzy and bleeding, pulled himself out of the vent and onto the main floor of the Vance house, where Jenkins and Clara were waiting. The house was structurally intact, but the silence from the basement was absolute. "It's over," Jenkins said, grabbing his arm. "The shadow is gone. We have to go. Now." They stumbled out into the pre-dawn rain, leaving behind the dark, wounded house. As Miles looked back, a single horrifying observation came to him. The self-destruct had worked. The basement was gone, the threat neutralized. But as they drove away, escaping the scene of the ultimate noise, Miles noticed something on the back of his own left hand, a faint, almost invisible mark. It was a complex, swirling symbol that hadn't been there before. Miles realized he hadn't just survived the final acoustic blast. He had been exposed to the absolute sound of Vance's final resonant frequency. And somewhere, deep in his own nervous system, the perpetual whisper was now taking root. The official report, filed meticulously by Miles and Jenkins after 3 days of grueling internal affairs interviews, was a masterpiece of controlled narrative. It cited a clandestine, highly unstable acoustic research lab discovered in the basement, resulting in a catastrophic internal pressure failure, and the presumed death of Professor Elias Vance and an unidentified armed assailant. The PSI file was classified and handed over to a specialized federal team that arrived with suits and briefcases, asking too few questions and demanding absolute confidentiality. Clara, the lab assistant, was placed under protective custody, her testimony conveniently dismissed as trauma-induced hysteria. Miles and Jenkins were cleared, but the experience had carved a permanent line between them and the rest of the world. Miles, however, carried more than just emotional trauma. The ruptured eardrums had healed, but the ringing, the tinnitus, was constant, a relentless high-pitched hum. And beneath the hum, there was the perpetual whisper, the faint rhythmic pulse he had transcribed in the vault. That he stared at the small swirling mark on his hand, a brand of absolute silence. While sitting in the sterile quiet of his apartment, Miles had started noticing things. Subtleties that it began with his perception of sound. At first he enjoyed the new level of quiet the ringing provided. But soon things became too quiet that he was sitting in the precinct bullpen, normally a cacophony of ringing phones and frantic chatter. Miles could hear it all, but the background noise, the air conditioning, the distant street traffic, the low murmur of conversation, seemed to be disappearing. The individual voices of his colleagues were crystal clear, isolated against a growing, soft void. Jenkins noticed his distraction during a case debrief. "Miles, you okay? You seem isolated." "I'm fine, Sarah," he lied, rubbing the mark on his hand. "Just the ringing." "It's not just the ringing," Jenkins insisted, her voice now sharp and distinct, standing out against the surrounding nothingness. "You haven't been sleeping. You're jumpy." "I hear everything, Sarah," Miles countered, his eyes flickering. "I can hear the secretary's pen scratching from across the room. I can hear your heartbeat." It was true. The AN exposure had somehow heightened his auditory reception for specific, direct sounds, while actively dampening the constant, normal acoustic noise of the world. He was living in a localized, self-contained auditory void. Later that night, the terror escalated. Miles was running an errand at a deserted grocery store at 2 a.m. He walked down the empty produce aisle that he heard the distinct, unnerving sound of a footstep. Heavy, rhythmic, and singular. He froze, his hand dropping to his service weapon. "Police? Who's there?" The sound stopped. Miles waited, sweeping his flashlight across the long, shadowed aisle. Nothing. He took a cautious step forward. Thump. The footstep echoed again precisely behind him. Miles spun around. The aisle was empty. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps were following him, but they were silent to the ear. They were not sounds waves hitting his eardrum. They were vibrations traveling up through the floor and into his bones. The same subharmonic frequency Vance had used to communicate through the vault. He had become the receiver. And someone or something was sending him a message. Miles broke into a run, the phantom thudding escalating into a terrifying rhythmic beat that synchronized with his own frantic heartbeat. He burst out of the store and slammed the car door shut. The thudding stopped. Miles sat gasping in his car. It wasn't the Echo Shadow. That creature was destroyed by the acoustic blast. This was something different. This was communication. Miles drove straight to Jenkins's apartment, waking her up at 3:30 a.m. "The case isn't over, Sarah. Vance left something behind," Miles whispered, holding out his hand and showing her the faint, swirling mark. "And it's talking to me." Jenkins, tired but concerned, let him in. "Talking to you? How?" "Through the floor. Through silence," Miles explained, pacing the floorboards. "It's the VNC protocol. Vibration-activated narrowband communication echo. I think Vance's last act wasn't the self-destruct. It was transmitting his residual frequency into my nervous system." Jenkins's face hardened. "So, you think you're a walking radio for a dead scientist?" "Worse," Miles said, looking down at his hand. "I think the Echo Shadow wasn't just a neurological hallucination. It was a secondary containment unit. And now that it's destroyed, whatever Vance was truly trying to keep locked up inside the silence is starting to find a new frequency to travel on." Miles stopped pacing, his eyes drawn to a photograph on Jenkins's bedside table. A picture of her and her younger brother, Officer David Jenkins, a patrol cop currently assigned to the downtown beat. As Miles looked at the photo, the floor of the apartment began to vibrate again. The rhythmic thudding returned, soft at first, then escalating. Thump, thump. But this time the thudding was accompanied by a clear, chilling visual in Miles's mind. An empty street corner, a flashing blue light, and the distinctive sound of an empty, overturned patrol car. The rhythmic thudding continued, tapping out a code directly into Miles's spine. It wasn't Vance this time. It was a warning. Point 3-0-1. 301, emergency code, officer down. "Miles, what is it?" Jenkins demanded, noticing the fear radiating off him. "That's David's beat," Miles whispered, staring at the photo. "And he's in danger. The silence is spreading, Sarah. And it just sent us a signal." Miles and Jenkins didn't bother with official channels. They knew the officer down signal Miles received was not transmitted over any police frequency. It was a subharmonic, desperate vibration channeled directly from the burgeoning auditory void. They drove toward David Jenkins's known patrol sector, the city streets blurring into smears of neon and rain. Miles held his service weapon, but his focus was entirely internal, fixed on the relentless, vibrating thump-thump-thump in the soles of his feet. "Tell me what you feel, Miles," Jenkins demanded, driving hard. "It's like a pulse, Sarah. Getting stronger, pulling us in," Miles said, gripping the dashboard. "The auditory void, it's not just a personal affliction anymore. It's localized, it's physical, and it's centered on David." They found the scene on a forgotten stretch of industrial road near the docks. A place where the city's perpetual noise was naturally dampened. Officer David Jenkins's patrol car was there, abandoned in the middle of the street. Its emergency lights were flashing, but the scene was unnervingly static. They approached cautiously. Miles immediately noticed the unnatural silence. The police radio, normally crackling with static and dispatches, was perfectly, profoundly silent. Not just muted, but actively, cleanly mute. "The radio is dead," Jenkins whispered, her breath fogging the cold air. "It's not dead, Sarah. It's inside a localized AN zone," Miles corrected, his eyes sweeping the area. "The silence Vance created. It's bleeding out into the world." They found the patrol car's door open. The area around the car was a disturbing absence of normal city noise. No wind, no distant sirens, no hum of power lines. Only their movements and their breathing seemed to make sound. Miles pointed to the ground beside the car. "Drag marks. Heavy." He didn't just walk away. The drag marks led across the asphalt toward an old, abandoned shipping warehouse, a massive, corrugated steel structure that swallowed the faint streetlight's hold as they moved toward the warehouse. Miles felt the vibration in his feet intensify, morphing into a new pattern, a repetitive, rhythmic scrape-tap-scrape that filled the auditory void in his mind. "What is that?" Jenkins asked, gripping her gun tighter. "It's the communication protocol," Miles breathed, "and it's telling me what happened. The shadow, or someone using its technology, it dragged David in there." They breached the main roller door of the warehouse, which groaned loudly, the noise momentarily painful in the silence. The warehouse interior was vast, dark, and filled with towering stacks of containers. "Miles, I don't see anything," Jenkins whispered. "No," Miles said, closing his eyes briefly to focus on the inner vibration. "He's not visible. He's protected by silence." Miles opened his eyes and walked straight toward a wall of 3 stacked cargo containers. He ignored the aisles and the clear line of sight, trusting the silent pulse. The scrape-tap-scrape was loudest here that he reached the containers and pointed to the small, barely visible gap where the containers met the floor. "The source of the silence is under there," Miles confirmed. "They're using the mass of the containers to dampen sound and create a perfect AAN zone." Jenkins shot a look of disbelief but quickly accepted his lead, seeing the chilling certainty in his posture. "How do we get him out?" "We don't," Miles said, drawing his weapon. "We shatter the silence. We need the opposite of acoustic suppression." Miles found a small, rusted piece of rebar on the concrete floor, a remnant of the city's decay. He slammed the metal bar against the corrugated steel of the container wall with all his strength. The sound was a flat, tinny clang. It wasn't loud, but it was raw, uncontrolled noise. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The entire wall of containers began to shudder violently. From the unseen gap beneath the containers, a loud, choking scream finally erupted, Officer David Jenkins's voice. "Miles, get me out. I can't hear anything. Can't hear myself." But with David's scream, the scraping sound on the floor increased, and a new noise joined the internal vibration in Miles's mind. A focused, high-pitched whine, the unmistakable prelude to the echo frequency. Miles knew the Shadow's technology was being deployed again, and this time, it was aimed at total, permanent silence. "Sarah, find the emergency release on the winch system. We have to move these containers." Miles kept slamming the rebar against the steel, creating a chaotic noise barrier. As he did, he saw a flash of black movement emerge from the gap beneath the container. A thick, articulated metal hand reaching out, not for David, but for the rebar. That it wasn't the full Shadow suit, but a fragment. A piece of the PSI technology, now mobile and operational, designed to neutralize noise. Miles slammed the rebar one last time, driving the sound right through the steel and into the gap. With a grinding shriek, the Shadow's hand recoiled. And then, the heavy container wall began to slowly lift, revealing a small, panicked figure. Officer David Jenkins, bound, gagged, and wearing a partial, crude version of the Echo Shadow's helmet that only covered his ears and eyes, designed to induce the auditory void. "Miles, the winch is failing," Jenkins yelled from the controls. "It's too heavy." Miles looked at the Shadow technology now writhing beneath the gap, and then at the massive containers overhead, slowly crushing David. That he knew what he had to do. He had to overload the silence within himself. Miles slammed the rebar against the container one last time, then tossed the weapon away. He pressed the swirling mark on his hand, the final remnant of Vance's frequency, and then he opened his mouth and screamed, a raw, sustained, uncontrolled, high-pitched shriek of pure human terror and defiance, directed straight at the gap. The sound was agonizing, overloading his own internal auditory void. But it was enough. The echo fragment beneath the containers recoiled violently, its circuitry smoking. The small creature of silence had been shattered by the ultimate personalized noise. Miles collapsed, spitting blood, but the container wall stopped moving. David was free. Jenkins ran forward, pulling her brother out. But as the AN field collapsed, a final metallic glint caught Miles's eye in the gap where the echo fragment had been. It was a dog tag, but not David's. Miles picked it up. It belonged to an officer R. Vance. Elias Vance's son. A cop. A second operative in the PSI program. Miles realized the truth. They weren't fighting a ghost or a creature. They were fighting a legacy. The aftermath in the warehouse was a controlled disaster. David Jenkins was safe, badly shaken but physically unharmed, the crude AN helmet having only induced extreme auditory and psychological distress. Miles, despite the severe trauma to his eardrums, was lucid, driven by the chilling discovery of the dog tag. Miles and Jenkins were back in the precinct interrogation room, not as suspects, but as witnesses to the rapidly unraveling PSI conspiracy. David was resting in the infirmary. Miles placed the dog tag, Officer R. Vance, Patrol Division, on the stainless steel table. R. Vance. Elias Vance's son, Miles stated, his voice hoarse. He's not just a copycat, Sarah. He's the architect of the second-generation silence. Jenkins stared at the tag, her mind reeling. But why? Why use his father's catastrophic technology against patrol cops? And why target David? Miles pulled up the digitized PSI file on the secure terminal. He navigated past the heavily redacted sections until he found the personnel logs. There it is. R. Vance wasn't just a patrol cop. He was the primary research assistant on Project Chrysalis, before his father became the Central Crystal. Miles clicked on a digitized journal entry filed under R. Vance's identification. It was dated 5 days before Elias Vance's disappearance. R. Vance journal entry. The auditory void is expanding. Subject A. Vance, Elias, is showing signs of critical emotional distress. He believes the AN field is a sentient entity. I've tried to shut down the project, but the Oversight Committee won't allow the data set to be lost. They intend to weaponize the Echo Shadow. They call it the perfect interrogator. The Oversight Committee, Miles whispered, connecting the dots. They weren't just researching silence, they were weaponizing fear. And R. Vance tried to stop them. He scrolled to the final, frantic entry, written the day Elias vanished. Frowny face. R. Vance journal entry. They are taking him. They are turning him into the power source. I failed to stop the shadow, but I won't let them use its true application. The committee uses a network of high-frequency signal boosters hidden in police equipment, radios, traffic cams, to control the shadow remotely. My father transmitted a counter-frequency into my system, a fail-safe, but I need to protect it. I have to disappear and I have to neutralize the control network before they activate the next phase. Miles looked at Jenkins. R. Vance didn't vanish like his father. He went deep cover. He's been using the fragmented Echo Shadow technology to disrupt the PSI control network, which is embedded right here in our city. And the cops he's targeting. Jenkins realized, her voice growing cold. They weren't random. They must have been part of the Oversight Committee, or unknowingly carrying the signal boosters. Miles nodded, pointing to the journal. R. Vance is fighting a shadow war against his father's creation and the agency that built it. He used David as bait because he knew David's patrol car was fitted with one of the primary PSI signal boosters, the source of the localized AN zone. Miles opened a schematic detailing the high-frequency relay nodes. It was a map of the city overlaid with dozens of small red blinking dots. The dots corresponded perfectly to the locations of the city's newest high-tech police camera and radio towers, all funded by a mysterious federal grant 2 years prior. This is the control network, Miles said, slamming his hand on the map. And the largest node, the central uplink, is located at the old Central Dispatch Tower on the edge of the city limits. If our Vance destroys that, he kills the entire PSI control grid. Suddenly, the lights in the interrogation room flickered violently. The digital clock on the wall sped up, the numbers blurring, before freezing entirely at 3:17 a.m., the same time Miles had received the original call on Elias Vance's case. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, oppressive. Miles felt the familiar, cold drain of the acoustic energy. The auditory void was expanding, originating not from the outside, but from the terminal itself. Miles looked down at the PSI file on the screen. The text was distorting, twisting into a single massive line of static. Then a new message flashed on the screen, overriding the text. It was a digital message, not a vibration, but its source was clearly R. Vance. Message, R. Vance. Detective Corbin. I know your frequency. The Oversight Committee found me. I was intercepted near the tower. They are activating the final phase, the global echo. They plan to transmit the AAN field across the entire network. The city will be drowned in silence. I can't stop it, but you can. They are using me as the transmitter at the tower. You need to use the noise inside you. The terminal powered down, plunging the room into darkness, leaving only the terror of the expanding silence. Miles gripped his own hand, looking at the faintly pulsing mark from Elias Vance. He had the final, uncontrolled frequency, the antidote to the PSI silence. The tower, Miles rasped, grabbing his coat. Vance is there. And they're about to silence the whole city. The old Central Dispatch Tower was a brutalist monument to obsolescence, its highest spire reaching into the heavy, thundering rain clouds. Miles and Jenkins arrived in the stolen unmarked sedan, the silence inside the car broken only by Miles's ragged breathing and the unbearable rhythmic thumping in his feet, the silent distress signal from our Vance. "This is it, Miles?" Jenkins said, grabbing her shotgun from the trunk. "The PSI Oversight Committee. We're going in blind against a government-funded panic attack." Miles didn't answer. He was already focusing on the swirling mark on his left hand. The mark wasn't just a physical scar. It was a node, a link to Elias Vance's final, desperate counter-frequency. He knew he was their only weapon against the acoustic weapon. They found the main entrance unsecured, a clear invitation. They moved through the labyrinthine maintenance halls, the air growing colder, heavier, and quieter with every step. The auditory void was massive here, centered on the tower's heart. They located the command center on the top floor. The door was steel reinforced. "Breaching," Jenkins whispered. She raised the shotgun, but Miles stopped her, putting a hand on the barrel. "No noise," Miles said, his own voice sounding distant, almost unreal. "We break the door, the signal goes out instantly." Miles pointed to the door's magnetic lock. He focused intensely on the mark on his hand, trying to channel the reverse resonance energy. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. He pressed his entire hand against the cold steel of the lock that he concentrated on the perpetual whisper in his mind, feeling the counter-frequency, the anti-silence, build up inside him. The energy flowed from his hand, not as sound, but as an acute, focused vibration. The magnetic lock whined, sputtered, and violently imploded, the sound contained to a dull thump as the mechanism tore itself apart. Miles kicked the door open inside. The command room was dominated by a colossal transmission dish, humming with electric power. 4 figures, all dressed in expensive, tailored suits, the PSI Oversight Committee, stood around a central console, monitoring the countdown, and in the center of the room, strapped into a complex array of acoustic resonators, was Officer R. Vance. His helmet was off, revealing a face pale with terror and resignation, wires snaking across his skin. "We knew you'd come, Detective Corbin," said the chairman, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Alistair. His voice was calm, almost bored. "The Vance frequency is too alluring. We just needed a vessel for the final launch." Miles and Jenkins raised their weapons, but before they could fire, Alistair made a small gesture. The surrounding walls, lined with advanced acoustic paneling, suddenly flared to life, emitting a low, silent pressure wave. The AN field in the room snapped into full focus. Miles and Jenkins stumbled, their internal world plunging instantly into the terrifying acoustic vacuum. The blood rushed deafeningly in their ears, and the fear, the echo shadow's neurological terror, began to claw at their minds. Alistair smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "The global echo initiates in 60 seconds. The world will finally be quiet. And you, Detective Corbin, will be our final test subject." Miles fought the rising panic. He saw our Vance, eyes wide with silent warning, struggling to nod his head toward the transmission console. Jenkins, her face contorted with the effort, aimed her shotgun at the central panel, but the distance was too great, the panel too protected. Miles dropped his weapon. He knew bullets wouldn't work. Only the anti-frequency could disrupt this. Miles looked at the mark on his hand, focusing everything he had on the counter-frequency that Elias Vance had imprinted onto him. He didn't just need noise, he needed resonant destruction. That he felt the energy shift inside him. The constant high-pitched ringing in his ears changed pitch, dropping into the terrifyingly low visceral rumble of the ultimate noise he had unleashed in the basement. Miles let out a silent roar, a purely internal sound that was so loud in his mind it felt like his skull was cracking. He charged straight at Alistair and the command console. The Oversight Committee members shouted silently, pulling out sidearms, but Miles was a man possessed. Moving on sheer acoustic adrenaline. He reached Alistair, not attacking him but grabbing the console itself. Miles slammed his left hand, the marked hand, onto the primary energy conduit feeding our Vance's rig. Miles poured the counter-frequency into the conduit. The central transmission dish screamed, not with a sound, but with a blinding, crackling release of pure, unfiltered acoustic chaos. The AN field shattered. The sound that erupted was the worst of both worlds. The deafening, physical noise of the exploding transmission dish mixed with the paralyzing, psychological silence of the collapsed AN field. The Oversight Committee members instantly collapsed, their eardrums rupturing, their minds exposed to the terrifying, conflicting frequencies. Alistair clutched his head, blood pouring from his ears and eyes, screaming a silent, final terror. Miles held on, his own body convulsing, the mark glowing white-hot on his hand as he sacrificed his own internal stability to the torrent of acoustic force. The primary console exploded in a flash of sparks and glass. The global echo was dead. Miles staggered back, falling to his knees. Jenkins rushed to him, but first she freed our Vance, who was weeping uncontrollably, the agony of the sonic collapse overwhelming him. The crisis was averted, the city was safe, and the PSI project was destroyed. But as the ringing in Miles's ears faded, replaced by a profound, exhausted quiet, our Vance looked at Miles with a desperate, terrified expression. "You saved the city, Detective," our Vance whispered, his voice raw. "But you didn't destroy the shadow. You just gave it a new host." Miles felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He looked down at his left hand. The mark was gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished skin. The counter-frequency was spent. But then our Vance pointed not at Miles's hand but at his partner. Miles turned to Jenkins, who was standing still, her face pale, staring blankly ahead. She wasn't ringing or screaming. She was enveloped in a perfect, small zone of absolute, unnatural silence. And as Miles watched, a faint, swirling mark, the exact replica of the scar he had just lost, began to bloom crimson on the back of Sarah Jenkins's right hand. The silence had found its new home. The command room was a silent graveyard. The Oversight Committee members were dead, killed by the ultimate acoustic overload. Our Vance was free but shattered, weeping silently on the floor. Miles felt a cold, sharp horror as he stared at his partner. Sarah Jenkins was motionless, her eyes open but vacant, and on the back of her right hand, the crimson mark of the perpetual whisper pulsed faintly. It transferred. Our Vance choked out, his voice weak. "When you released the counter-frequency, the energy had to go somewhere. The shadow didn't need the suit anymore, Detective. It needed a receptive consciousness. And she was right next to the conduit." Miles slowly rose, ignoring the pain in his body. "Sarah, talk to me." Jenkins blinked, her expression slowly shifting from vacant to terrifyingly placid. She lifted her right hand and gently touched the mark. "It's quiet, Miles," she said, her voice a flat, dead monotone, perfectly clear and devoid of any emotional resonance. Finally, truly quiet. Miles knew the shadow wasn't a creature. It was a program, a neurological feedback loop. And it had uploaded itself into his partner's mind. "The silence is a lie, Sarah," Miles pleaded, moving closer, his hand outstretched. "It's the psychological vacuum. It's the opposite of life." Jenkins took a step back, her eyes fixed on Miles but looking through him. Her movements were unnaturally graceful, like the echo shadow itself. "No, Miles. It's control," she countered. "The whole world is noise, the lies, the panic, the fear. I can filter it all out now. I can hear the pure, crystalline truth of the void." She pointed across the room with a sudden, sharp gesture. The Oversight Chairman, Alistair, was dead, slumped over his console. But as she pointed, the massive transmission dish, despite being crippled, let out a low, mournful hum that only Miles could perceive, vibrating up through the floor. The system is still partially active, Jenkins stated, her voice chillingly precise. And I know how to fix it. We can launch the global Echo Miles. We can deliver salvation. Vance scrambled away terrified. You have to stop her, Detective. That's the shadow talking. She's the host now. Miles looked at his partner of 8 years, the pragmatic, fearless woman who had stood by him through the worst the city could offer. Now she was offering him the void. Miles knew he couldn't use noise. The uncontrolled acoustic blast was what drove the shadow into a new host in the first place. He needed a different frequency, a truly resonant one. We were partners, Sarah, Miles said, his voice raw with emotion, fighting to keep the tremor out. We promised we'd never let the job take us. You are more than this silence. Miles focused entirely on the perpetual whisper, the memory of the counter-frequency he had carried, the sound of life he had suppressed. He needed to find the frequency that canceled the shadow without destroying the host. Jenkins smiled, a chillingly blank expression. The job is the silence, Miles. Don't fight it. She reached out, and as her hand moved, the mark on her skin pulsed, and the remaining acoustic dampening material on the walls began to subtly compress the air, trying to establish a new, localized zone around Miles. The pressure was building rapidly. Miles closed his eyes, ignoring the building pressure and the ringing in his ears. He focused on the rhythm of his partner's breathing, the rhythm he knew intimately. He found the frequency of her heartbeat, the sound of Sarah, not the shadow. Miles opened his eyes. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, portable digital recorder he always carried for case notes. He slammed the play button. The recorder wasn't playing sound, but vibration. It was the raw, unedited recording he had made of their last normal conversation, hours before the whole case went sideways. A mundane recording of them arguing about who owed whom coffee, the familiar, exasperated sound of her own voice, laughing as she called him an old tin-ear, hit the AIR.IT. Wasn't loud. It wasn't destructive. It was simply a genuine, unexpected piece of acoustic resonance from her past self. Jenkins froze. The pressure wave around Miles instantly dropped. Her eyes lost their vacant stare, flickering with brief confusion, a flash of recognition. The tin ear. She murmured, her voice momentarily regaining its familiar, exasperated tone. That moment of human resonance was enough. The shadow, dependent on the psychological void, was momentarily displaced by a genuine human memory. Miles lunged forward, not to fight, but to break the physical connection to the shadow's power. He grabbed Jenkins's marked hand and slammed it down onto a heavily grounded electrical conduit, the only stable metal in the room. The shock was immediate and violent. The mark on Jenkins's hand exploded in a flash of blue energy. The shadow's frequency, the parasite, was instantly discharged into the earth, unable to withstand the raw electrical noise. Jenkins screamed, a real human sound of pain and shock. She collapsed into Miles's arms, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow. The crimson mark on her hand was gone. Miles held her tight, the silence in the room finally settling into a true non-threatening stillness. Vance stared at them, his eyes filled with gratitude and horror. You saved her. You canceled the frequency with memory. Miles helped Jenkins up, supporting her weight. She was shaken but alive. The shadow was truly gone. 3 weeks later, Miles sat alone in his apartment, the only sound the gentle hum of his own life. The case was closed, the tower demolished, and the PSI file buried beneath more layers of bureaucracy than ever before. Jenkins